Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to have this opportunity to come and talk to you. I'm no longer currently the professor, I'm retired. But anyway, the whole thing got started some 20 years ago. I'm a solid state physicist, theoretical physicist, and the professor who was teaching astronomy at our university suddenly passed away. And somebody had to take over his classes. And I was volunteered. I did not have much background in astronomy. The astronomy that I had learned was very old, Keplerian astronomy, simply calculating orbits of planets and so on, nothing beyond that. And no knowledge of modern astronomy that was. So, and this was summer. And so I had to learn astronomy to teach my students. And I was barely ahead of my students by one lecture. I never let my students know that I was struggling as hard as they were. But anyway, at the end of the semester, I don't know who suffered more. One thing led to that is that in that course, this was a course for non-science majors, and talks about history of astronomy. And it talked about Babylonian astronomy, Chinese astronomy, Greek astronomy, but no Indian astronomy. I felt that no, this would not be right. Because I had learned about these nakshatras even when I was a boy. My father taught me all the 27 nakshatras, so I knew that that must be something. But anyway, I looked at all the texts at that level. Out of 24 texts, only 2 texts mentioned anything about Indian astronomy, and both were wrong. And then I started, okay, no, this cannot be. So I started looking into Indian astronomy, and one thing that led to this. But about that time, in the 1995, a software became available. That's called the planetarium software. This is a program which can project the view of the sky at any time, any place. This program has been used continuously by NASA for programming their telescopes to see which area of the sky they have to observe and so on. But this became available for PCs. The PCs were just becoming popular at that time. So I thought I could use this effectively to study the ancient Indian astronomy. Indian texts have a lot of astronomical information. And so whether we could use the software to go back in time and see when those events happen. So that happens to be the. Okay, so this is the outline of my talk. Basic of astronomical method, and the date of Shatapatha Brahmana, date of Vedanga Jyotisha, and the date of Mahabharata war. And so it will be determined as the date of the war comes out to be a unique date as 3067 BCE. And this is based on the astronomical information. I'll talk about the ones that I have used. And this date must be taken as the sheet anchor for any history of Bharata, because 3000 BC. Okay. Now what is this software? Simply projects the view of the sky. This is, for example, on the midnight of April 10 at College Park. So you still have time to go and watch it. Okay. Now what this shows is the big circle that is, so if you're lying on the ground and looking up at the sky, all the stars that you see are enclosed in the circle. The circle happens to be what's called the horizon, that is the circle that you can think of, that you can draw as far as the eye can see. Of course, the computer can show you what is below the horizon. It doesn't happen in reality. Not only that, you can look at the sky and see what happens. For example, this is on April 10th, 6 a.m. The sun is already up. If you go outside, you can't see any star in reality, but the computer screen can show you all that. There are 2 things that I want to show there. You should just, is there a pointer here? No, pointer. April 10th happens to be a new moon day, Amavasya. The sun and the moon are together, and so you see both the sun and the moon, and there are a couple of planets there. Of course, the computer can show that, but and you see all these stars. You can't really make out much of it. So you can add a few lines to that. Now you can see some patterns. What the ancient observers did was to look at the stars and connected them with various shapes so that it could identify the patterns of stars. And there are also a couple of lines there. You can see one is called the celestial equator at the top, and the other one you see is what's called the ecliptic. So our sense of time comes from three fundamental motions. All of you know that. The rotation of the Earth on its axis, the revolution of the Earth around the sun, and the revolution of the moon around the Earth. Rotation of the Earth gives you the sense of day, revolution of the Earth around the sun gives you the year, and the revolution of the moon gives you the month. Now we live on the Earth and observe all these patterns, and so we think the Earth is stationary. Then it appears as if the sun moves along and the moon also moves along in the sky. All stars rise in the east and set in the west. That includes other planets too. And that is because of the rotation of the Earth from east to west. The revolution of the Earth, it's projected onto the sky, is called the ecliptic. The sun follows that path. And the Earth's equator, when you project it to the sky, that becomes the celestial equator. The celestial equator, the horizontal line you see is the horizon, and the celestial equator cuts the horizon at exactly the east. That's the east point. And now we can see the sun and the moon. They move along the ecliptic, and you see the names like Ashwini, Kritika, Rohini, and so on.
Screen interrupt. You can use the pointer, center button.
Center.
The white one.
Oh, this one. Yes. Don't worry. Anyway, so when they move, both the sun and the moon move along the ecliptic. Since the Earth takes 1 year, and that ecliptic is a very great circle, the sun appears to move by 1 degree a day, 360 degrees in a year. The moon covers the same distance in a month, 27.3 days. So the moon is the fastest moving object in the sky, and to observe the moon's position along that, our ancient seers, Indian ancient seers, picked up bright stars, 27 of them along the ecliptic, and each is called an Achar. And the names are, you can see some of them, Dhanishta, Ashwini, Bharani, Kritika, Rohini, and so on. You all know that you have a birth star. When you go to perform some ritual, they'll ask you for Sankalpa, and they ask you, what's your star? That star simply says that the day you were born, the moon was near that bright star. That's the star. So for example, on April 10th, what's the star of the day? Revati. You observe this Kritika, that's called Pleiades. Now, as time goes on, what happens is all the stars below the horizon move, and they rise. That's across the horizon, so they rise, move across the sky, and set in the west. So Kritika, when it rises, will be quite far from the east point. The east point is where the celestial equator cuts. It's almost about 35 degrees north of the east point. Now this is where all that information comes in handy. Date of Shatapatha Brahmana. Shatapatha Brahmana is one of the ancient texts. It belongs to the Yajurveda, Shukla Yajurveda Samhita, and it simply describes various ways of the things to do in in performing yajnas. In fact, it is the oldest manual that's available for performing yajnas. And one of the things is that when a householder starts his new life, he has to start the fire at home, the Garhapati Agni, for the first time. So the question is, what is the auspicious time to start that? And Shatapada Brahmana gives you the answer. To start that, you must start it under the day when the star of the day, or the nakshatra of the day is Kritika, because each nakshatra has a presiding deity. The presiding deity for Kritika is Agni. So if you perform the Ajnadhana, that's the first starting fire at home, on that day, it will become very prosperous. Very natural argument. Well, anyway, so it says, and then the other question asks, why should you do it under Kritika? Is there any other reason? And the reason also given that Kritikas rise exactly in the east, and other stars are quite deviated from that. So, about 100 years ago, Deepshit has said that this refers to a time when the Kritikas were exactly on the equator, and so that came to about 3000 BC. So I said, well, let's see if you can use the planetarium software and to see when Kritikas were exactly on the horizon. Now you see here is exactly at the bottom, you see the Kritika rising above the horizon, exactly at that point, and that comes to be 2927 BCE, and so that's 3000 BC, so that fixes what Deepshit had said earlier. And now comes the taking of Vedanga Jyotisha. In learning Vedas, you have to study under 6 angas, shadangas, 6 parts that you learn to become scholars in Vedas. One of them is Jyotisha, astronomy, and it is referred to as the science of time. Vedanga Jyotisha is the earliest manual, astronomical manual that we have. And it describes how to calculate the Tithi and Nakshatra. And, oh, did I say about Tithi? No. Okay, let's go back. You remember that along the ecliptic, the sun moves 1 degree per day. The moon moves at 13 degrees per day because it covers the same circle in 1 month. So there is a difference of about 12 degrees between the sun and the moon. And that difference of 12 degree, phase difference between the sun and the moon, is referred to as a Tithi. On Amavasya day, both the sun and the moon are together. The next day, the moon has moved by 13 degrees, the sun has moved by 1 degree, so there's a 12 degree, and that 12 degree is Pratipat. Another next day, another 12 degrees, 24 degrees. So by 15 days, it has 180 degrees, and that becomes Purnima. So this is the simply mathematical way of looking at these things. And one of the statements in Vedanga Jyotisha is that the winter solstice occurs at Dhanishta Nakshatra. And one of the things that I had done with this investigation was to identify what the stars are. There is a list available. This was done by some scholars, but this was based on what are called Yogataras from Siddhantas, and these were Siddhantas was written about 500 CE, and those coordinates were converted into equatorial coordinates, extrapolated to 1900 BCE, and then compared with modern catalog to arrive at that. I felt that this way of conversion, extrapolation, all that involved a lot of errors. So why not look at the skies as the Vedics themselves would have seen and identify them? So what I did was I removed all those lines and all those only bright stars, and then I took the identification that Kritika is to be identified the Pleiades. And we know when Kritika was on the equator, that is at 3000 BC, and at that time looked at hundreds of new moon days and full moon days when you knew exactly where the sun and the moon would be. And knowing the nakshatra of the day, you could identify that. So I did the whole analysis and came up with the identifications of the nakshatras. And these 27 nakshatras, most of them agreed with what was available in the standard, what's called the Calendar Reform Committee produced by Professor Saha and Lahiri. but 6 were different. And one of them is Dhanishta Nakshatra. So I used the Dhanishta Nakshatra to see when this the winter solstice occurred. And you see that's the sun at 270 degrees on the, so that is this winter solstice, and it is at Dhanishta Nakshatra, and that happened in 1862 BCE. So I came up with the date for the Vedanga Jyotisha as about 1800. The traditional date accepted for Vedanga Jyotisha until this time was about 1400, from 1100 to 1400. So I propose that it should be 1800 and not 1400. So anyway, this gives you a flavor of the way to look at the data and arrive at a date. Now this goes back to what is history, and of course the Western scholars declared that Indians have no sense of history, and so they wrote history for us. And so the fixed point in history was taken to be the invasion of Alexander and Megasthenes, and that was taken as the fixed point, and everything else was fixed with that. But many historians have actually felt, Indian historians, that Mahabharata war should be taken as the fixed point for central, say Mahabharata war is a central landmark in Indian traditional history, and fixing the date of that war gives us a starting point in settling dates of events occurring before and after that. So that was the question. So this was started around 2000, and it has progressed in a number of stages, and been made a number of presentations, or we call that. And this is one of the first presentations. This was a conference in Montreal in 2001. And that is the title of the book, and it's edited by Professor Mani. And I have an article in that, and that's where I first made the presentation on the date of the Mahabharata war. And there's a conference in Bangalore in 2003. And this was an archaeoastronomy conference in Flagstaff. This was purely Western astronomers, archaeoastronomers, and I made a presentation there. When did the war take place? Mahabharata, the epic itself, says, Antare chaiva samprapte kalidvapareyo rabhut samanta panchake yuddham Kuru Pandava senayoho. The war between the Kuru and the Pandava. That was one of the quiz questions I remember. That took place at the junction of the Kali and Dwapara. Nowhere else does the epic say anything about when the Kali Yuga began or when the Dwapara ended. It only says it between those two. And of course the traditional belief is that the Kali Yuga started in 3102 BCE based on the Panchanga calculations. So this would put the date of the war around 3000 BCE. But many scholars did not believe that. So they said, well, we should use other methods. Linguistics, textual evidence from the Vedic text, genealogical lists, Vamshavali from the Puranas, astronomical references, archaeological evidence, and so on. Many publications have appeared. Nearly half of all these publications are based on astronomical references. In fact, this has become an industry to determine the date of the Mahabharata war. And I am one of the culprits. So if you look at the date of the war and the number of authors who are given a date, you'll see that there is a large number for 3000 BCE. And there are even a few for 5000 BCE. And as far as even some as late as 1000 or even 900, 800 BCE. This is taking all evidences, that's all the methods they have used. But what about those using only the astronomical information? The same kind of distribution and not much different from that. And here's a listing of this. Some of the, when I first started, there were a few dates. Two works have just been published. One was by Professor Achar, who was the director of the Space Research Institute in Bangalore, and that came out in '97. And the other one was by Professor Siddharth, who was the director of the Birla Planetarium in Hyderabad. And they gave the dates 955 BCE for the war, 1311 for BCE for war again. And there were two others. One was by Professor Sengupta, and the other one was 3067. So I said, well, let's look at these 4 dates. They span about the same range as all the others, and use this planetarium software to see what we can do and how do you go about it. So first to look at is, what are the types of astronomical information that's available in the epic. It refers to eclipses, so lunar eclipse and solar eclipse, planetary positions, specific days, tithi and nakshatra, and equinoxes and solstices. Pretty good set of data. Except they are distributed in all the parvas. There are 18 parvas, and you can find them in almost every parva, except these 3 parva. Parva number 5 and number 6, you can see they contain the largest number. Parva number 5 is Udyoga Parva. That's where Krishna goes on a mission of peace, meets with the Dhritarashtra, and the talks go on for a few days, and the talks where war becomes imminent. Vyasa records the exact tithi when Krishna left Upaplavya Nagara to go to Hastinapura. When the peace talks started, when it ended, gives all the nakshatras. And on the Uttara Phalguni day, that's the nakshatra of Uttara Phalguni, Krishna goes back to Upaplavya Nagara, and on that day, Karna rides with him. And there is an exchange of conversation, you know the whole story. And during that conversation, there is exchange of astronomical information. And then, on the eve of the war, Vyasa meets with Dhritarashtra and tells him, what horrible things your son has done. And I see these omens which are the harbingers of the great disaster that's going to happen. And so he gives a list of omens about the war that's going to happen. So those 2 parvas contain the largest number of astronomical references. Well, these astronomical references are really astrological in nature because they really pertain to omens. And there are others. So how can you use the planetarium software? Use it in a passive mode. Well, you take a set of benchmark events and pick any date and see if on that day these benchmark events occur. Right? Now where do you start for that? It turns out that all the scholars, with no exception, have criticized the astronomical references in the Bhishma Parva as unreliable, unscientific, contradictory. In fact, Professor Sengupta says these are astrological effusions fit for Mother Goose's tail. So you can't believe any of them. So I didn't want to get into that controversy. So that leaves only one parva in the whole of Mahabharata. That's where a lot of specific information is available. Okay? So Krishna lives on the diplomatic mission for peace on the Revati Nakshatra, and reaches Hastinapura on Bharani Nakshatra. And that happens to be Kartika Purnima, so there is a lunar eclipse on that day. And the talks go on for until Pushya Nakshatra day, that way everything fails. And then Krishna hangs around there for a few more days, and then returns on the day of Uttara Phalguni. Karna and Krishna ride together, and then at that time, after all that talk, Krishna finally advises him, Saptamacchapi divasa amavasya bhavishyati. 7 days from now, there's going to be an amavasya. Sangramo ijjitam tasya shakra devatam. let the war rituals be started on that day of nakshatra whose deity is Indra. That nakshatra is Jyeshtha nakshatra. Says 7 days, is on Uttara Phalguni day, he says 7 days from now, there's going to be an Amavasya on Jyeshtha nakshatra. Let the war rituals be started on that. Take this message to Drona and Bhishma. That's what Krishna says to Karna. At that time, Karna says, I see many omens which bring harm to the Kuru family. And he says, Shaneshwaraha Pidiyati, that is, Shani is afflicting Rohini Nakshatra, and Angaraka has performed a retrograde motion before reaching Jyeshtha. And so these bring great harm to the Kuru family. So I thought this would take the basic set of events. For two reasons. One is, this is the conversation between the two main characters in the epic. And in fact, when I was giving a talk in one of the audience said that, "Aya bhaiya, ye to Bhagavan ka vachan hai." So anyway, so that's and then these are the Bhishma. I will come back to that later. See, that's the comment on Bhishma. All this is hopelessly inconsistent astrological effusions of evil omens fit for Mother Goose's tale. We cannot put any faith in any statement of this chapter of Mahabharata. So, this was the attempt. So I took the data from Udyoga Parva. And remember this. Krishna leaves Uplavinagara on Revati Nakshatra, comes to Hastinapura on Bharani Nakshatra, peace talks go until Pushya Nakshatra. Karna and Krishna ride together on Uttara Phalguni. There is a lunar eclipse on Kartika Purnima. There's going to be a solar eclipse on Jyeshtha Nakshatra. Shani is at Rohini, and Angaraka has performed a retrograde motion. Right. Let's look at Professor Kochar. He says there are more than 150 references, but these are nothing but poetic imagery, so you don't really do anything. And he still believes there was one solar eclipse, and he gives a date for that. 4th October 955 BCE. I can pull my software and go for 955 BCE and look at what happens. There is a solar eclipse. See the sun and the moon together? Except it is at Vishakha Nakshatra and not Jyeshtha. Jyeshtha is somewhere in the middle. So there is a solar eclipse, but that is not the eclipse described in the Mahabharata. And since his whole theory is based on that eclipse, if he does not agree with what is in the epic, we should reject his date. Agree? Yes. Okay, thank you. And of course there are other things. We don't have to go into those details. In fact, the point is that it doesn't agree with anything in that. So 955 is not the date. Siddharth gives the date of June 24, 1311 BCE. So I looked at the software. Turns out that June 24 is not a new moon day. So it cannot have a solar eclipse. But there was a solar eclipse on June 14th. Perhaps this was a printer's error. After all, there's only one place where it's 24th. He might have it in 14, but it can't. Okay, let's take that. So let's go to June 14th. There is a solar eclipse. See the sun and the moon together? But it is a Punarvasu, not Jyeshtha. So, Professor Siddharth, there are other things which don't agree. So, that date is not the one. Professor Sengupta, he accepts that there should be a Amavasya and Jyeshtha Nakshatra. He does give importance to that. Saptamarcha Divasat Amavasya Bhavishyati. He accepts that. So there is an Amavasya and Jyeshtha Nakshatra. But it's not an eclipse. The sun and the moon are far apart. Right? So he says There was an eclipse 2 years before this date, and somebody remembered it and just added it into the epic interpolation. I don't think we should accept such theories. And there are other things. Saturn is near Kritika, not at Rohini, and in any case, 2449 is not the date. Those are simply the details. Now, Raghavan, who gave the year 3067 BCE, he not only gave the day 3067 BCE, he also gave a chronology. He said Krishna left Hastinapura for Hastinapura on September 26, and then he reached Hastinapura on September 28. So he gave a whole day. And this was a real pleasure for me because I can just put the date and see what happens. September 26, 3067 BCE, the moon is at Revati. So it's Revati Nakshatra. Fine. One tick mark for Raghavan. He arrives at Bharani. It's a full moon day. Right? And in fact, it's Karna who says that there's going to be a solar eclipse. Krishna only said 7 days from now there's going to be an Amavasya. It was Karna who says Rahu Arkam Upaiti. So Rahu is going to approach him. And that is I superposed the path of Mars on the same, because this takes place over a 6-month period. In fact, it started earlier. But you see, the Mars comes along, turns back, and then goes away. He turns back before reaching Jyeshtha. Jyeshtha is the prime star here. So it's exactly what the epic said. And then winter solstice is on January 13th. And you know the story of Bhishma. Bhishma waits for the arrival of the winter solstice and dies on the Ashtami Tithi and Rohini Nakshatra. And let's see what happens there. Rohini Nakshatra, and you see the moon, quarter moon, that's the first quarter moon, so that is Ashtami. So Shukla Ashtami, Rohini Nakshatra, Magha Shukla Ashtami, and Bhishma gets back. So every event that was described in the epic agrees with the date given by Professor Raghavan.
What was the tithi then?
Ashtami. Ashtami. Magha Shukla Ashtami. Okay. Here is one event that you should remember. This is on the 14th day of the war. Drona is in charge. They break all rules of war. They continue to fight into the night. And they stop the war only when the moon rises. And they describe the moon rises at 2:30 or so in the morning. And this is for the 8th day, because war starts on number 22nd, and then this is the 8th day of the war that ends. And you can see that the moon is just rising at exactly the time. So all these events agree with what the description in the epic, right? All right. So far, so good. But that doesn't prove that that was the date it happened. All it says is what Professor Raghavan has given agrees with all the events in the epic. There could be many other dates. Have you tried all of them? So is there any way we can do that? And what about all those references in Bhishma Parva? We just want to neglect all that? What justification is that? So you need to look at that a little more carefully. So since all these are omens, there are 2 chapters in Bhishma Parva. There are 79 verses. 20 verses contain anything to do with astronomy. And so I started to look at, is there anything about omens, where I can find information. So by this time, I had become an index pandita. So I started to look at all the indexes of books and see if omens, nakshatras, or anything like that occur. In Atharva Veda, I came across some, but not any information. There is one book called Atharva Veda Parishishta, appendix to Atharva Veda. And there I saw a heading, Yuddha Suchaka Lakshana. Hi, this is something. So, opened the page, looked at the shlokas there, and to my surprise and immense happiness, there's word by word agreement with the omens mentioned in Atharva Veda Parishishta and Bhipipam. This was amazing. So, okay, some details, I will skip that. Okay, these are descriptions why the references in Bhishma are contradictory and confusing and so on, because the interpretation that I have given, there are mentions of grahas, and grahas have been interpreted as planets. And so if you look at Shani, at one place it says Shani is at Rohini, in another place it says Shani is at Shani and Brihaspati are in Vishakha. Shani cannot be in two nakshatras at the same night. It's the slowest moving planet. So these are all astronomical absurdities. And then there is Shweta Graha, which was interpreted as Venus, Shweta, white, interpreted Shweta Graha, and cruel planets were interpreted Mercury, Venus, and again they are given different positions on the same night. So these are all the things. But then the thing that was clinched, that was, there is one description there. Grahau Tamraruna Shikhau Prajwalitau Brihaspati Shnaishcharau. See that? Two grahas with blazing with coppery red hair, and he calls them Shnaishchara and Brihaspati, and they were near Vishaka. Now, has anybody seen any planet with red coppery hair? It's the comets that have hair. In fact, the word comet itself comes from the Greek word for hair. So what the Vyasa is describing is not planet, but comets. So the graha means not only planet. Graha comes from the word that grasp. Anything that can grasp, that means anything that comes near a nakshatra would be a graha. It can be a planet, it can be an asteroid, it can be a comet, or it can be anything. So, and in fact the terminology he uses is really amazingly modern. He says reference to some things, comets as Surya Putra, Angaraga Putra, and so on. Now, even in modern terminology, there are many comets which have short periods. And if their orbits lie within the orbit of, for example, Jupiter's orbit, they are said to belong to Jupiter's family. And so if you refer to that as Brihaspati Putra or Guru Putra, it's exactly the same terminology. So looking at all that, then I decided that the descriptions that are occurring in Bhishma refer mainly to comets and not planets. It's only all this. I'll simply summarize the analysis. The references in Bhishma occur in 4 different segments. And scholars had said that because they are not continuous, these were later interpolations, and they are so contradictory. But not so. The first segment are indications of an imminent war. This is where I found it from the Atharva Veda Parishishta. Agreed completely. And then the second segment indicates great harm to the Kuru family. And this turns out to be exactly the same omen that Karna describes to Krishna in Udyoga Parva. Karna is worried about the Kuru family. So he describes the same omens. Now Vyasa is referring to Dhritarashtra. Then Vyasa tells the omens which are destructive to both armies, and the 4th segment refers to the destruction of the entire population. So, and here is a comparison of the Atharva Veda Parishishta and Bhishma Parva. You can go through the details, but it's, in fact, it's even better in the Sanskrit original. They are word by word almost the same. Arkheta parigalenam pariveshvarka chandrayoho lakshalohita varnashcha sarveshcha vicharanam. What you should look for in predicting a war. And he says, Yuhede Maharaja Bhavishyati Mahan Kshayaha Yathemani Nimittani Bhayayopalakshate Ubhe Purvapare Sandhye Nityam Pashyami Bharata. This Vyasa says, I am watching the sun and the moon every day and night, every day in the evening and morning. And he says, Krishna Grivaha, Suviditaha, Trivarnaha, Parigaha, Bhanuapida. And he says, those are things you should observe, and he says he has observed it. So that predicts that the war is imminent. Alakshaha Prabhahinaha Purnamasi Visha Kartiki. So there was a lunar eclipse on Kartika Purnima. And then there is a description in through the Parishishta, Tamro Bhavati Shastraya, Ruksho Bhavati Mrutyave. What happens to the color of the moon on the lunar eclipse day? If it is Tamra Varna, it predicts a Yuddha, and then the other one predicts death. And then there is a description of 2 eclipses occurring within a period of 13 days. And here is first one is from Bhishparva, and this is the last shloka is from Atharvaveda Parishishta. And this is Yeditu Rahurubhav Shashibhaskaro Grasati Paksham Anantamantataha Pururita Kardama Vahini Bhavati Bhuhu Varshati Navarshati Madhvaha. And then he says Chandra Surya Ubhav Grastav Ekamase Trayodashi. It's exactly the same thing that he's saying. Well, there are more and more like that. And so, finally, the 2 events that actually match, both with Udyoga Parva and Bhishma Parva, are these events. Saturn is at Rohini, Shani at Rohini. Angaraka has performed a retrograde motion, so lunar eclipse and Kartika Purnima and a solar eclipse at Jeshta. So search for the years from 3500 BCE to 500 CE. After all, we know that Shani takes 30 years to go around once. So if it's at Rohini now, it will be there again in 30 years. So in how many times that Shani can be at Rohini between those years? Only 137 times. No more, no less. Right? So take one of those 137 years and see if Angaraka performs retrograde motion. Angaraka performs a retrograde motion once in 680 days. And the retrograde motion does not occur at the same nakshatra. So look for Vakra motion for Angaraka near Jeshta. From among those 137 years, that reduces to 17. In 17 of those days, Shani is at Rohini and Angaraka is performing a retrograde motion near Jeshta. And now look for a solar eclipse near Jeshta in those. Turns out it reduces that set to 2 years. 3067 BCE and 2183 BCE. I said, okay, all you have to do is to pick the other one. I think I said here lunar eclipse first or a solar eclipse, it doesn't matter because both of those years have both of them. So there is no choice between those two now. With those events, they are both years, 3067 BCE, 2183, both satisfy that. And now the question is, how can you decide between them, or can you decide between them? Now you remember that slide I showed you on the 4th day of the war? Okay. In order for 2183 to agree, the war must have started on an Amavasya day. Then it fits all the dates. But if the war started on an Amavasya day, what's going to be the 14th day? It is near Purnima. What time does the moon rise on that day? It's in the evening, just as the sun is setting. The moon would not rise early in the morning, so it cannot be, but it happens in 3067 BCE. So it shows that 3067 BCE is a unique year. It satisfies all these. So what Srinivas Raghavan had said, had worked out manually, is now shown to be true, and there is also a reason for that, because it takes a combination of these 4 events, and it can occur only at a unique time. So that fixes the date of the Mahabharata war. And this shows how to, in 2183, there is also a Shani is at Rohini, you can see that. And I don't know if I have. Yeah, and there is a solar eclipse at Jeshta, and all the other things also match for 2183, except the 14th day of the war. So, thank you for